Louis Farrakhan begins not with fury, but with a clarification that immediately challenges how he has long been portrayed. He admits his anger openly, but not the kind people expect. His anger is not aimed at individuals, not driven by revenge, and not fueled by hatred. It is directed at oppression, at injustice, at systems that have for generations denied dignity, opportunity, and truth. And from the very start, he makes one thing clear: rage alone has never transformed a human life, and it never will. This distinction matters, because it reframes everything that follows. Farrakhan argues that anger, when rooted in love and guided by purpose, can become a force for rebuilding rather than destruction. Where critics see hostility, he points to outcomes: people lifted from prisons, freed from addiction, restored to self-respect. His message insists that social change does not begin with tearing others down, but with restoring what has been taken from within: identity, confidence, and self-worth. What made this speech so controversial and ultimately so feared was not volume or provocation, but clarity. Farrakhan confronted accusations without shouting, challenged narratives without threats, and exposed contradictions without calling for violence. He spoke calmly about issues many preferred to keep buried, and he did so while insisting on moral discipline, responsibility, savior, and self-knowledge. That combination unsettled institutions far more than anger ever could. This is why the speech was labeled dangerous. Not because it encouraged chaos, but because it encouraged awareness. Not because it called for hate, but because it rejected submission. Farrakhan's words asked a simple but unsettling question: what happens when people learn to love themselves in a world that benefits from their self-doubt? Before we continue, take a moment to support this channel. If stories that challenge official narratives, restore forgotten context, and explore the deeper roots of history matter to you, please like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Every click helps keep these conversations alive, and every share helps the truth travel further. After drawing a clear line between righteous anger and destructive rage, Farrakhan shifts the focus from emotion to evidence, from accusation to outcome. He does not ask to be judged by headlines or labels, but by the lives changed in the quiet spaces far from television cameras. In his telling, a ministry rooted in love is not defined by slogans or speeches, but by transformation that unfolds slowly, often invisibly, in communities society has already written off. This is where his argument deepens, because love, as he presents it, is not sentimental or passive. It is demanding, corrective, and deeply uncomfortable for those who profit from despair. He speaks of men who entered prison stripped of identity and purpose, reduced to numbers and survival instincts, and of what happens when someone finally speaks to them as human beings again. In these spaces, he argues, anger alone would only harden what is already broken. What changes people is discipline paired with dignity, accountability paired with belief, by teaching self-respect, structure, and responsibility. He claims that lives once consumed by cycles of crime and addiction begin to reorient themselves toward meaning. These are not abstract ideas to him, but lived experiences that challenge the assumption that certain communities are beyond repair. The same logic extends to his confrontation with drug abuse, which he frames not merely as a personal failure, but as a symptom of deeper wounds. He describes addiction as an escape from a world that has systematically denied worth, history, and hope, and he insists that lasting recovery cannot come from punishment or shame alone. Instead, he emphasizes the restoration of identity, the recovery of purpose, and the rebuilding of self-image. When people are taught that their lives matter, that they come from something greater than what they see around them, destructive habits lose some of their grip. In this sense, love becomes a form of resistance, a refusal to accept the narrative that decay is inevitable. Farrakhan also places particular emphasis on restoring dignity within the Black community, especially in how individuals see themselves and one another. He speaks about lifting women from conditions that demean and endanger them, encouraging standards of self-respect that challenge both exploitation and internalized despair. He speaks about education, not as formal schooling alone, but as awakening, turning ignorance into curiosity and isolation into shared purpose. Knowledge, in his view, is not simply power, but protection, shielding communities from manipulation by forces that thrive on division and confusion. What emerges from this portrait of his ministry is a philosophy of self-uplift that directly contradicts the image of chaos often associated with his name. Rather than encouraging dependency or resentment, he calls for unity and collective responsibility, urging people to pool resources, support one another, and build from within rather than wait for rescue from outside. This insistence on self-determination is presented not as rejection of others, but as a necessary step toward genuine equality. A community that stands on its own feet, he argues, cannot be easily controlled or dismissed. It is precisely this focus on internal transformation that makes his message so unsettling to powerful institutions. Teaching people to love themselves sounds harmless, even admirable, until its consequences become clear. Self-love, when paired with historical awareness and moral discipline, produces individuals who ask harder questions, accept fewer lies, and refuse to see themselves as permanent victims. Farrakhan's narrative suggests that the most radical act is not anger directed outward, but clarity turned inward, a rebuilding of identity strong enough to withstand distortion. In that sense, his ministry of love is not soft at all. It is confrontational in the deepest way, because it challenges a world that depends on broken self-images to remain unchanged. As Farrakhan moves deeper into his argument, the conversation inevitably reaches the shadow that has followed him for decades. The assassination of Malcolm X. He does not approach the subject defensively or with outrage, but with a question that reframes the entire narrative. If his involvement were as central as critics claim, why, he asks, was his name absent from the original reports, court records, and headlines at the time of Malcolm's death? Why does this accusation grow louder, not in the immediate aftermath, but decades later, long after memories have hardened into myth? He invites listeners to consider how history is handled when it involves powerful interests. When leaders die, their legacies are often shaped not by truth, but by usefulness. Farrakhan points out that Malcolm X, once vilified in mainstream media as dangerous and extreme, was gradually rehabilitated into a symbol of courage and moral clarity. This transformation, he suggests, was not accidental. Once Malcolm was no longer alive to challenge systems of power, his image could be softened, sanitized, and safely celebrated. The living, however, are far more difficult to manage. A voice that still speaks, still organizes, still influences minds cannot be reframed so easily. From this perspective, Farrakhan argues that resurrecting Malcolm's name alongside his own serves a strategic purpose. It creates confusion, redirects attention, and plants doubt without requiring proof. Rather than reopening legal proceedings or presenting new evidence, the accusation is tried in the court of public opinion, where repetition can substitute for facts. He suggests that this method is far more effective than confrontation because it weakens credibility while preserving the appearance of moral concern. The story becomes even more troubling as he discusses the men convicted of the crime. Farrakhan references testimony that emerged after the trial, including statements indicating that those imprisoned may not have been responsible, and that information capable of reopening the case was ignored. He does not claim to know who ordered or carried out the assassination, but he challenges the logic of collective blame, insisting that no movement or faith should be condemned for the actions of individuals, especially when the full truth remains unresolved. To him, the refusal to revisit the case reflects not a commitment to justice, but a preference for a narrative that serves institutional stability. This argument ties directly back to the broader themes of the speech. Farrakhan presents the accusation not as an isolated controversy, but as part of a recurring pattern used against figures who disrupt accepted boundaries. When ideas begin to resonate too widely, when messages of self-respect and independence gain traction, character becomes the battlefield. History is reshaped, motives are questioned, and unresolved tragedies are repurposed as tools of suspicion. In this way, the past is weaponized against the present. What gives this section of the speech its emotional weight is not defiance, but restraint. Farrakhan does not ask for sympathy or absolution. Instead, he asks for consistency. If truth matters, then evidence should matter. If justice matters, Then silence in the face of credible doubt should be questioned. He reminds the audience that genuine accountability requires courage, not convenience. Hint. And that easy narratives often survive precisely because they relieve society of the burden to investigate deeper. By placing the Malcolm X accusation within a larger discussion of power, memory, and control, Farrakhan transforms a personal charge into a reflection on how history itself is managed. He suggests that the most effective way to neutralize a living movement is to bind it forever to an unresolved past, ensuring that suspicion lingers even when proof does not. In doing so, he reinforces his central claim that truth is rarely silenced through force alone, but through stories repeated often enough to feel unquestionable. This moment in the speech does not seek to close the chapter on Malcolm X's death. Instead, it exposes how that chapter continues to be edited, by, selectively reopened, and strategically cited. Farrakhan leaves the audience not with a verdict, but with an unease that lingers, urging them to ask who benefits when questions are asked too late, and why some truths remain perpetually postponed. Building on his challenge to the revived accusations, Farrakhan turns his attention to the mechanism behind them, shifting the focus from individual blame to institutional behavior. He argues that when influence grows beyond acceptable limits, confrontation rarely comes in the form of open debate or legal scrutiny. Instead, it arrives quietly, through repetition, framing, and insinuation. Allegations are not examined in courtrooms, where evidence must withstand scrutiny, but circulated through headlines and commentary, where suggestion alone can erode trust. In this environment, truth does not need to be disproven. It only needs to be drowned out. Farrakhan describes this process as a deliberate substitution of character judgment for factual examination, rather than reopening cases, reviewing records, or inviting transparent investigation. The media revisits unresolved accusations as settled conclusions. The result is a permanent cloud, one that follows a figure regardless of context or clarification. He suggests that this approach is not accidental because it allows powerful institutions to appear neutral while quietly shaping public perception. The accusation becomes a shortcut, saving the effort of engaging with ideas that are difficult to counter on their own merits. What makes this strategy effective, he explains, is timing. The resurgence of these claims coincides not with new discoveries, but with moments when his voice reaches wider audiences and his message gains renewed traction. As communities begin to organize, to ask questions, and to assert self-respect, the narrative shifts away from those outcomes and back toward controversy. Attention is redirected from what is being said to who is saying it, from substance to suspicion. In doing so, the conversation never has to reach the uncomfortable issues at the heart of his message. Farrakhan contrasts this media-driven judgment with the standards of justice he believes should apply to any serious accusation. If evidence exists, he argues, it should be examined openly and legally, not hinted at endlessly without resolution. If wrongdoing occurred, it should be addressed through due process, not recycled as rumor. By avoiding formal reassessment, institutions preserve ambiguity, which serves them better than clarity ever could. Ambiguity allows doubt to linger indefinitely, weakening credibility without requiring accountability. This pattern, he suggests, extends far beyond his own experience. Throughout history, figures who challenge entrenched systems often find themselves reduced to symbols of danger rather than voices of dissent. Their words are rarely confronted directly. Instead, their character is questioned until listening to them feels risky. Farrakhan places himself within this broader tradition, arguing that the goal is not justice, but containment. A voice framed as controversial can be ignored without addressing its claims, dismissed without engaging its logic. What gives this argument cohesion with his earlier themes is its emphasis on control through perception. Just as self-hatred weakens communities from within, distorted narratives weaken movements from the outside. Both rely on internalizing doubt, whether about one's worth or one's credibility. Farrakhan implies that the same forces that resist self-uplift also rely on media narratives to maintain imbalance, ensuring that influence never grows unchecked. He does not deny that scrutiny comes with visibility, nor does he claim exemption from criticism. Instead, he questions why scrutiny so often avoids substance, why discussions about rehabilitation, self-knowledge, and unity are sidelined in favor of recycled allegations, why transformation on the ground is overshadowed by controversy in the abstract. To him, this imbalance reveals intent. If the goal were understanding, conversation would follow evidence. If the goal were truth, investigation would replace repetition. By framing media attacks as a substitute for legal and factual engagement, Farrakhan reinforces the central tension of the speech. Power, he argues, rarely fears noise, but it does fear clarity. A message that encourages people to think independently, to value themselves, and to question inherited narratives threatens stability more than anger ever could. And so, rather than confront that message directly, institutions rely on familiar tactics, reviving old shadows to dim present influence. In this way, Farrakhan's claim is not simply about personal reputation, but about how dissent is managed in public life. When ideas cannot be easily defeated, attention shifts to the messenger. When influence cannot be ignored, it is reframed as danger. The story he tells is not one of persecution, but of pattern, inviting listeners to look beyond the accusation itself and examine why it is repeated, when it is repeated, and who ultimately benefits from keeping it alive. As the conversation reaches its most charged moment, Farrakhan addresses the label that, more than any other, has been used to freeze discussion and shut down listening. He does not raise his voice when the phrase is mentioned, nor does he respond with outrage. Instead, he treats it as a symptom, not an argument, asking what purpose such a comparison is meant to serve. To him, the label is not a description of belief or behavior, but a shortcut designed to end conversation before it begins. He is careful to draw clear lines. He rejects any association with violence against innocent people and denies hostility toward others based on faith or identity. He speaks of moral boundaries that, in his view, cannot be crossed without betraying the very principles he claims to uphold. By grounding his response in ethics rather than emotion, he reframes the accusation as a distortion rather than a debate. The power of the label, he suggests, lies not in its accuracy, but in its emotional weight, because once applied, it discourages nuance and replaces listening with fear. Farrakhan then shifts attention to why such language emerges at all. He argues that history shows a pattern. When a figure demonstrates the ability to influence large numbers of people, especially those long excluded from power, fear follows closely behind. That fear, he suggests, rarely announces itself honestly. Instead of saying, "We are afraid of what this movement could become," institutions cloak anxiety in moral outrage. Accusations escalate. Language intensifies. Commistem's placisme, and the individual is recast as a threat rather than a participant in public discourse. What troubles him most is not personal offense, but the effect this framing has on the audience. Labels like these do not simply criticize a speaker. They instruct listeners on how to feel before they hear a single word. They collapse complex arguments into caricatures and replace engagement with reflexive rejection. Farrakhan implies that this dynamic serves a specific function, because movements built on self-awareness and collective dignity are far harder to control than those driven by resentment alone. He connects this moment back to his broader message about self-uplift. Mobilization, in his telling, does not mean aggression or retaliation, but awakening, teaching people to value themselves, to understand their history, and to act with discipline creates a kind of unity that cannot be easily redirected or distracted. It is this potential, he argues, that alarms those who benefit from fragmentation and doubt. Fear of mobilization is then transformed into accusations of extremism, because it is easier to discredit a movement than to address the conditions that gave rise to it. Farrakhan also challenges the inconsistency he sees in public reactions. He notes that strong language is often tolerated, even celebrated, when it reinforces existing power structures, yet becomes unacceptable when it questions them. Passion is praised when it defends the status quo and condemned when it seeks change. By pointing out this double standard, he suggests that the issue is not tone or rhetoric but direction. Who is being encouraged to stand taller, and who feels unsettled when they do. Throughout this exchange, his demeanor remains measured. which reinforces the contrast he wants the audience to see. The calmness of his response stands against the severity of the accusation, highlighting the gap between image and reality. He does not ask for agreement, only fairness. Listen to the message, he insists, rather than reacting to the label attached to it. Evaluate outcomes instead of accepting assumptions. In weaving this response into the larger narrative of the speech, Farrakhan presents the accusation as another example of how influence is policed in public life. When a voice begins to resonate beyond expected boundaries, the response is rarely dialogue. It is containment through language, fear through association, and silence through stigma. By rejecting the label without mirroring its hostility, he reinforces his central claim that his work is not about stirring hatred, but about awakening agency. And it is precisely that awakening, he suggests, that makes such labels feel necessary to those who fear what informed, unified people might choose to do next. As Farrakhan brings his message toward a close, the focus shifts from defense to vision, from responding to accusations to outlining what justice might actually look like. He frames the question of reparations not as an act of resentment, but as a matter of historical accountability. When harm is acknowledged without repair, he argues, it lingers across generations, shaping lives long after the original injustice has ended. Slavery, in his telling, was not merely a chapter of suffering, but a system that stripped people of language, family, culture, and self-perception, leaving wounds that statistics alone cannot measure. He draws comparisons to other moments in history where accountability took tangible form. When victims of mass injustice received recognition and compensation, it was not viewed as charity, but as a moral obligation. Farrakhan asks why the descendants of enslaved Africans should be excluded from that same standard of justice, especially when the effects of that history remain visible in poverty, inequality, and fractured communities. Reparations, as he describes them, are not simply about material compensation, but about acknowledgement, repair, and the restoration of dignity that was deliberately taken. Yet what makes this conclusion distinctive is that it does not place responsibility solely on governments or institutions. Farrakhan repeatedly returns to an inward starting point, insisting that no external remedy can succeed without internal transformation. True liberation, he says, begins with self-knowledge. A people who do not know their history cannot fully understand their present, and without that understanding, they are vulnerable to narratives that diminish their worth. Learning who you are becomes an act of protection, anchoring identity against distortion. From self-knowledge flows self-love, which Farrakhan treats not as vanity, but as survival. He argues that communities taught to see themselves as disposable often internalize that belief, turning frustration inward through violence, addiction, and despair. Loving oneself, by contrast, creates resistance to those patterns. When people value their own lives, they become less willing to harm one another and more willing to build together. Self-love, in this sense, becomes the foundation of peace rather than its opposite. Unity is the final pillar of his conclusion. Farrakhan emphasizes that divided communities are easier to exploit, easier to distract, and easier to control. Unity does not require uniformity, but it does require shared purpose and mutual respect. By pooling resources, knowledge, and effort, he argues that people can begin addressing their own needs rather than waiting indefinitely for solutions from outside forces. This unity, rooted in awareness and dignity, is presented as the most enduring response to historical injustice. The speech closes not with anger, but with resolve. Farrakhan leaves listeners with the idea that justice is not a gift to be granted, but a condition to be built, both internally and collectively. Liberation, he suggests, is not a single moment, but a process that begins in the mind and extends into action. It is the decision to reject imposed limitations and to redefine one's worth on one's own terms. Thank you for staying with this story and reflecting on its deeper meaning. If this message resonated with you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you do not miss future stories that explore history, power, and the ideas that continue to shape our world. Your support helps keep these conversations going, and every view brings us closer to understanding the past with clarity and purpose. Understanding the past with clarity and purpose. Understanding